Hi guys, tonight I'll take you far north, where wind-swept seas cradle longships and the sky changes colour with every hour. It's a tale of a life both fierce and tender, of cold steel and warm fires, of the salt-stung taste of the ocean and the quiet heartbeat of home. This is the story of a young woman born into a world where the horizon itself is never still, and where the only thing sharper than a sword is the will to survive. You'll walk in her boots, see the frost on her lashes, and hear the slow creak of oars in the midnight fog. You were born in the coastal settlement of Huldrek, a scattering of longhouses crouched against the wind, as if trying to keep their secrets from the sea. The winters here were long and pale, with the light stretched thin like spun glass. Even as a child, you knew the world was larger than these stony shores. Your father's stories of raids and distant kingdoms painted your imagination in colours you'd never seen. He was a fisherman first, warrior second, but when he spoke of battles, his voice grew low, as if each memory carried both pride and weight. Your mother was no less formidable. Her hands knew the weight of nets and the heft of a blade, for in Huldrek, survival did not favour the idle. From the start, you were not content to simply watch the men train on the green patch by the shore. You picked up driftwood and swung it as they did, copying their stances. You listened when they spoke of balance, of not letting the enemy's gaze trap you, of the importance of knowing the ground beneath your feet, as well as you knew your own breath. The older boys laughed, but they laughed less when your blows began to sting. Your life was measured in tides. Spring brought the herring runs, the shallows turning silver with life. Summer meant calmer seas and the return of the longships heavy with goods and stories. Autumn was for preparing, drying fish, patching sails, sharpening iron. Winter was for endurance, for staying alive while the wind keened like a restless spirit. Through it all, you trained when you could, a shadow at the edge of the warrior's circle, learning by watching, by doing. One evening, when the sky was the colour of dying embers, a ship returned bearing more than trade goods. They brought with them a woman unlike any you had seen, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the shade of wheat in high summer, and eyes that seemed carved from ice. Her name was Brynhild, and she was a Shieldmaiden. She fought beside men, not behind them, and her presence stirred something deep within you. She did not stay in Huldrek long, only through the season's end, but during that time she spoke to you more than once, her words heavy with meaning. If your hands can hold a sword steady and your heart does not waver, then you have a place on the shield wall, she told you one morning as frost glittered on the grass. But remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It's knowing fear and standing anyway. From then on, your training was no longer in secret. Your father did not protest, though he looked at you as though he could see the storms you would sail into. He taught you to read the wind, to steer by the stars, to lash down a shield so it would not slip under a blow. Your mother showed you how to mend torn mail, to bind wounds with what the earth provided, to braid your hair so it would not tangle in combat. The first time you stood in a real shield wall, you were 16. It was not during a raid, but in defence. A band of outlaws from inland came seeking food and plunder, thinking the fishermen of Huldrek easy prey. They came at dawn, their boots crunching frost, their breath steaming in the cold. You held your place beside your father, shield locked with his, the weight of your spear heavy in your grip. The clash was quick, a brutal burst of noise and motion, and when it ended you were still standing. Blood spattered your cheek and your hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the raw knowledge of what it meant to fight for your home. That winter, you found yourself restless. You wanted to see the lands your father spoke of, to feel the roll of the open sea beneath you for more than a day's fishing. And when the thaw came, so too did an opportunity. A longship under the command of Jarl Eirik needed another shield. They were sailing south for trade and perhaps more, and they would take you if you could prove your worth. The test was simple. Stand against one of Eirik's warriors for 3 bouts. You would not need to win them all, but you would need to show that you could endure. The man they put you against was twice your weight and older by a decade. He swung his sword in great arcs meant to intimidate, but you remembered Brynhild's words. You did not try to match strength with strength. You stepped where he did not expect, let his weight overcommit, struck at the openings. You lost the first bout quickly, held longer in the second, and in the third, your shield caught his wrist just right, sending his sword into the dirt. The crew laughed, clapping your shoulders, and Eirik himself gave a single nod. You had earned your place. The night before departure, you stood on the shore alone, the ship's dark shape bobbing against its moorings. The wind was sharp with salt and promise. Behind you, the fires of Haldrek glowed warm, but before you lay the cold, endless pull of the sea. You could feel the path before you unfurling, long and uncertain, but bright with the hunger for more. You closed your eyes, listening to the slow slap of water against the hull, and felt the truth of your life settle like steel in your bones. You were leaving in the morning, and whatever the sea brought you, glory, danger, sorrow, you would meet it with shield in hand. Dawn arrived like a breath held too long, released in a pale ribbon over the water. Frost filmed the thwarts of the longship, and your palm left an oval of warmth when you touched the wood. Men moved in quiet shapes through the milky light, tying lines, checking lashings, setting bundles beneath the benches. Eirik's voice carried without strain, the way a seasoned captain's does, neither harsh nor gentle, only sure. You tucked your mother's sewing kit into your sea chest and slid your shield into its place along the gunwale, where it would both guard the side and wait for your hand. The paint on its face was still new, oak leaves swirling around a white knot, the mark of Haldrek's small grove. It made you think of breezes that smelled of sap, of bees and resin, and the first bright greens of spring. Those thoughts were a comfort and a point of ache, both at once. There was a little ceremony before departure, because all sensible folk know that water has moods. Eirik raised a bowl of ale and let some spill onto the planks. Old Arnor, with his narrow eyes and hands knotted like roots, murmured a prayer to Njord to keep the seas even, and to Ran to keep her net elsewhere. Someone tucked a bit of bread beneath the stem of the mast. You placed a curl of sheep's wool, spun by your mother, into the chink between two planks where pitch had dried and glossy. It was a simple thing, but as your finger pressed the ward into darkness, you felt steadied, as if your home had found a pocket here and would ride along. "Push off," Eirik said, and the world changed. The longship slid out of the shallows with an elegant reluctance, hull hissing when shingle surrendered its grip. The first strokes were always the heaviest, and you felt them from shoulder to heel. Oars bit and lifted again, and your breath matched the rhythm until everything that was you became part of that repetition. There were 19 oars aside from the steerboard, and each had its own mind. It took a while for the crew to find the temper of the day. Oars clashed, a curse was muttered, someone laughed too loudly because he was nervous and pretending not to be. Your arms burned. By the time the sun made a thin coin of itself above the horizon, the muscle had warmed into something trustworthy. The shore of Haldrek unspooled behind like a story told soft and then softer, until the longhouses were only strokes of colour against the hill. You knew that within them were the familiar sounds, goats shifting, a kettle set on a hook, your mother's foot on the threshold. You imagined her standing at the door, hands on hips, watching the ship become a dark fleck, then nothing. You imagined she nodded once, not to you, but to the sea, acknowledging the bargain. "Keep your wrists loose," said the man at your bench, a wiry soul named Kettle, who had white scars like delicate roots along his cheeks. He spoke without turning his head, eyes on the loom of the oar. "Let the oar carry some of the weight. Don't try to master it at every stroke. It'll tire you, and it won't listen." You did as he said and felt the difference. Not less strain, but cleaner strain, as if the oar and your body were sharing a conversation instead of shoving each other. Kettle nodded once, almost imperceptibly. His gaze drifted to the water. "Porpoises," he said a few moments later, and there they were, low dark backs slicing, a family pacing your course like companions not yet acquainted. Eirik set the sail when the wind made its intention plain, and the oars rattled back into their leather loops. The relief ran through the crew in a subdued wave, shoulders lowering, mouths loosening into half smiles. The sail filled with a sound like a sighing forest, and the ship settled into the long animal motion of being wind-borne. You had been under sail before, but near shore, and always with an eye to coming home at dusk. Out here the light stretched and gathered, grew a little golden around its edges, and the water changed colour every time you blinked. You laced your fingers and felt the sting of salt in your calluses, already beginning to crack, though the day was but young. There was a scold aboard, as there is on most journeys if the ship is lucky. His name was Hrani, grey-bearded and slow to speak. But when he did, people listened as if a hearth had just been kindled. He sat near the mast now, carving something small and secret from a piece of driftbone. Later he would sing, and the oars would find his rhythm, and the air would seem warmer because of it. For now he hummed under his breath and watched the sea with a gaze that took in more than waves. You ate when told, and did not when not told. Eric kept a strict order, and it fit the ship's bones. Watches were assigned for nightfall, and you were given second watch, when the world is deep and the mind begins to wander, if not held in hand. Kettle showed you how to lash your sea chest so it would not slide and bruise shins when the waters grew choppy. Old Arnor taught you the knot he preferred for securing the sail's clew, his fingers surprisingly nimble. Always the same way, he said, even when frightened, especially then. Hands that have learned honesty do right by you when your head is a storm bird. The first ache of the voyage was not in your muscles. It was in your gut, a slow swirl that rose to your throat and made your mouth water. Seasickness is a private humiliation, and you swallowed hard against it, fixed your eyes on the far line where sky met water, pressed your toes into the planks as if to say, "Here is ground." Kettle noticed without comment. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt, shook out a pinch of dried herb, and pressed it into your hand. "Chew," he advised. "It tastes like regret, but it helps." It did taste foul, bitter and sharp, but the bite steadied the rolling inside you until the world's motion and your own made a kind of accord. In the middle of the day, the wind freshened, and the ship leaned, shouldering through darker water. Spray leapt and salted your lips, and the sound of the hull talking to the sea grew lower, almost a growl. Eric stood near the steerboard, like a man listening to a long story, occasionally touching the blade to guide the course. You watched his hands and thought of Brynhild's remark about the shield wall. That courage is knowing fear and standing anyway. Out here, courage was a slower thing, the kind that shows itself by staying, by keeping a grip on what needs holding. You found you liked this kind of courage. It did not ask you to blaze, it asked you to endure. By afternoon the horizon gathered a smudge, land or a cloud pretending. Birds began appearing in ones and twos, then in a loose string. They flew with purpose, and purpose is often a sign of land. The crew's voices took on a speculative note, a little more lively. Hrani finally raised his head and gave a line of song, a thread barely taller than the wind, and men took it up. The words were a praise of oars and of time, of the way both cut and heal. You sang too, softly at first, then louder, letting your voice be a plank among planks, nothing special, necessary all the same. Near evening the smudge proved a headland, low and furred with dark forest. There would be a river mouth somewhere, or a cove where the bottom held an anchor well. Eric did not change course yet, only watched. "We do not rush," he said, not loudly, but the idea settled like a blanket. A rushing crew snaps like an overstretched rope. You set the sail a touch, adjusted the yard with Kettle, felt the ship's mood alter in your hands. While you worked, your mind skittered to the tools at your belt. The short seeks with the carven hilt your father had given you, the whetstone smooth as river skin. The bone needle and waxed thread you would need when something tore at the wrong place and at the wrong time. You had mended mail before, but not at sea, and certainly not while a friend bled salt and red together on the planks. The thought did not frighten you. It traced a path your life might walk, and you nodded to it as one nods to a neighbour in the lane. Night comes faster near water, the way a curtain seems to fall even if you've been watching each inch descend. The sail was lowered, the oars came out, and the ship's pace slowed to the sure, deliberate gait of a hunter easing through brush. Fires were not lit, not near unknown shores where other eyes might be waiting, but cold meat and hard bread went around, and someone passed a skin of spirits that warmed your belly and made your ears hum. Stars stitched themselves up one by one. You leaned back against your sea chest and watched them arrange their old arguments. When your watch came, The world had narrowed to wood underfoot, breath of men, slap and whisper of small waves. You stood near the mast where you could see Eric and the pale path the ship made through silvered water. The wind had gone elsewhere. Fog began in the distance like smoke and then was simply there, a white animal pressing its flank to the ship. Sound changed shape inside it. A gull's cry became odd, disembodied, as if the bird had become voice only. Ketil, off watch now, slept curled like a dog, his hands still lightly clenched as if holding an oar. Rani's humming had ceased. Old Arnor snored in a slow rhythm that matched the hull's creak. You felt the fog on your cheeks, cool and wet. It made the hair at the nape of your neck prickle. Eric lifted one hand and held it at shoulder height, a signal to ease. Oars dipped more gently. Somewhere to starboard a low sound rolled, a horn, deep and patient, not one of yours. It came again, not nearer, not farther, just present, like a thought you could not place. You tasted iron on your tongue without knowing why. Eric did not speak. His hand stayed in the air, and the longship moved as if deciding whether it was night or dream. You reached for your shield and felt the familiar weight settle into your palm, the leather grip warm from your body's heat. The fog laid its finger against your mouth as if to say, "Listen." The horn's call lingered in the fog like the aftertaste of something strong, faint but impossible to forget. The crew moved with a strange carefulness now, each man's breath sounding louder than the sea itself. The oars dipped in silence, leather straps sighing in their loops. Even the woods seemed to hush. Your heartbeat began to count the moments between each sound, measuring a rhythm that was not your own. Eric's hand dropped at last, and the oars stilled entirely. The ship drifted, its momentum a slow, unspooling thread in the dark. All around you, the mist pressed close, soft and thick enough that the nearest stars were nothing more than smudges. The smell of the sea changed, less salt, more earth. Somewhere near, water moved differently, folding back on itself in a way that told of a shore you could not see. The horn did not sound again. When Eric spoke, his voice was low and calm, but every ear turned toward it. Keep your hands on your weapons. We'll wait for the tide to take us a little farther from that sound. No splashing, no talk. The oarsmen adjusted their blades just enough to guide the ship in a lazy arc, letting the current draw her away from whatever had shared the night with you. The fog clung to your hair, beading on the fine strands like dew on spider silk. You swallowed hard, the tang of the damp air resting on your tongue. Time stretched oddly in such a place. You could not tell whether minutes passed or whole hours. Once a shadow darker than the mist slid to port. No shape, just an absence where the grey should have been. Ketil's hand drifted toward his seeks, but the thing did not approach. The sound it made was faint and wet, like the turn of a body in shallow water. Then it was gone. The tide carried you until the fog thinned enough to let a bit of starlight through, and Eirik steered toward the faint outline of the headland you'd sighted earlier. No one spoke until the keel gritted softly on sand, and the ship rested with a sigh. You helped haul her higher, boots sinking into the damp shore. The sand was dark, flecked with small shells and glinting pebbles. Beyond it rose a fringe of low pines, their silhouettes ragged against the sky. Here, the night seemed easier to breathe. Men set down their shields and checked gear in silence, their movements brisk but unhurried. Eric sent 2 men to keep watch along the tree line, their cloaks melting into shadow. The rest of you settled in a shallow hollow above the high tide mark. There would be no fire, only the faint glow of the stars and the pale smear of the moon low on the horizon. You lay on your back, cloak pulled tight, listening to the quiet creak of timber cooling after a long day under sail. Somewhere in the dark, something scuttled across the sand, claws ticking faintly. Your mind turned over the sound of the horn again and again, wondering who had blown it and why. Traders? Raiders? A hunting party from the inland forests? Or something older, less willing to give its name? Sleep came fitfully. Dreams crowded close, cold, silver-lit images of black water and faces glimpsed just beneath its skin. When you woke, the sky was already lightening, the air brittle with morning chill. The pines behind you whispered in a breeze that smelled faintly of resin and damp earth. Arik roused the men with a quiet word, and soon the ship was sliding into the water again. The morning wind was steady and cool, filling the sail in a gentle curve. The headland fell behind, and with it the memory of that unseen horn, though it lingered in the back of your mind like a shadow you could not quite place. By midday the coast unfurled into low, rolling hills veined with streams that bled into the sea. You passed a cluster of huts near a river mouth, their thatched roofs bowed like old men. A few figures watched from the shallows, fishermen by the look of their nets, but none called out. One of them raised a hand in a brief, almost reluctant greeting, and Katil returned it with a nod. The ship followed the coastline south, where the wind smelled different, warmer, carrying hints of things you could not name. Rani said it was the scent of lands where winters are shorter and the earth holds more sweetness in her belly. You found yourself leaning over the side, watching the changing colour of the water, how it shifted from deep iron to something greener, livelier. It was near this time that Eric called for a halt at a small, sheltered cove. The place seemed unremarkable at first glance, just a curve of sand tucked between two rocky arms, but the way the men moved told you it was known to them. They set about their work with quiet efficiency, dragging the ship ashore just enough to rest her keel, then untying bundles and casks. Eric explained that this was a hidden store place, one of several along his route, where goods could be left for allies or picked up when the need arose. You helped carry a heavy sack of dried fish up the slope to a flat rock marked with shallow runes. There, Kettle showed you how to conceal the goods beneath a lattice of driftwood and brush so they would escape the notice of strangers. "Nothing here is left by accident," he said. "If you find a place like this, you're either trusted or you're already in trouble." The stop was brief. Soon you were pushing off again, the cove shrinking to nothing as the wind caught the sail. Afternoon stretched into a softer gold, the air warm enough now that you loosened your cloak. Rani took out a small three-stringed lyre and plucked a slow tune that seemed to match the ship's rocking gait. Some of the men hummed along, others simply closed their eyes and let the music fold itself into the rhythm of the sea. It was during this quiet that the lookout called softly from the bow. Ahead, half hidden by the shimmer of distance, was another vessel. Its sail was dark against the sun, and it moved not with the wind but with steady strokes of oars. Eirik stepped to the steerboard, his eyes narrowing. He did not give the order to change course. The ship ahead altered its heading slightly, just enough to suggest it had noticed you. The space between you began to close, though not quickly. You could see now that its prow was carved in the shape of some long-beaked bird, the wood weathered and pale. No flag flew, no colours to tell you who they were. Eric's voice carried low but firm. "Shields to the side. No weapons drawn unless I say." You took your place along the gunwale, your shield fitting snug against the next. The weight of it felt different now, heavier with the knowledge that it might be needed soon. The other vessel came on, its oars dipping in perfect unison, water flashing from each blade like silver scales. When it drew close enough, you could make out faces, hard, wind-browned, expressionless. The man at their helm was broad and bald, with a braided beard the colour of old bone. He raised one hand in a slow greeting, palm outward. Eric mirrored the gesture, but his other hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword. The two ships drifted nearer, until you could hear the creak of their timbers and smell the tar in their seams. The bald man's eyes swept over you all, pausing on your face for just a moment longer than the others, as if weighing something. Then his gaze shifted back to Eirik and he smiled, not wide, not warm, but enough to show the edge of intent beneath it. The bald helmsman's smile settled like a thin layer of frost, pretty only if you did not touch it. His ship's oars drew in with a practiced rattle, and for a breath the two hulls lay abreast, close enough that if you leaned too far you might have traded ships without wetting your boots. The men on his benches watched with the placid attention of wolves considering the strength of a fence. Not angry, not even hungry, just measuring. Eirik did not raise his voice. "Wind's fair," he said, as if commenting to the air. "Where do you run from, and where do you run to?" The helmsman turned his head a fraction, as if testing how far his neck would go before the bones protested. His beard was bound with bits of bone and dull copper, and one of the pieces clicked softly against another when he breathed. "From fog," he answered, which was true enough for any sailor, and left the rest to mystery. And to markets, he added, his eyes sliding like skates over thin ice. My name is Skade. These are honest men, and this is an honest keel. Ketil's knuckles whitened on the edge of his shield, but the lines of his face did not move. Old Arnor's eyes were half-lidded, as if he were falling asleep on his feet. You felt the ship's planks under your boots, each board familiar already, and made your breath as slow as the tide. Honesty is a banner many fly, Eirik said. Few earn it. What tidings do you carry, Skard? Skard turned his palm upward once more, a gesture harmless as an empty bowl. Tidings cost the same as rope, he said, cheap until the sea asks for them. He tipped his chin toward the distant headland you had hugged the night before. There are men on that shore who light fires with dry grass and accusations. They ask tax of ships that never swore to them. They claim a river mouth as their granary, and they hunger enough to eat words. You may pass today without paying. Tomorrow, perhaps less luck. Rani shifted near the mast, his thumb still on the lyre's frame. And you? He asked mildly. Do you eat words, Skade? Skade's teeth flashed, quick and businesslike. Only when the fish are scarce, he replied. His gaze drifted to you and rested there for a heartbeat, no more. Something like curiosity lit behind it, not unkind, not kind either. You have a new board in your wall, he remarked, as if counting timbers, and looked back to Eirik. You carry herbs and cloth, iron scraps for mending what foolishness breaks, and perhaps enough blades to make foolishness think twice. I say this not because I wish any of it, but because naming is a way to keep the night from growing larger than it is. Eric's mouth barely curved. Then we are well named. He jerked his chin toward the helmsman's benches. And you carry salt pork and barrels of something that thinks it's ale. Furs too warm for this season, and a priest's cup wrapped in sailcloth under your third bench, because he said it would bring you luck, and because you felt it would fetch a price better than luck. We know each other. The minute of silence that followed felt heavier than a shout. Then Skade laughed, real and dry, as if a knot had admitted it might untie after all. We do, he conceded. Then hear one more thing. A horn sounded in last night's fog. It did not belong to me. It did not belong to any I would sup with. If you taste that note again, turn your keel toward open water and let the wind teach you forgetting. The men on his ship shifted, a rustle like grass under snow. Eric's eyes, pale and steady, did not leave Skade's face. Your warning's a coin I'll not spit on, he said, but the sea teaches many lessons. Some of us learn stubbornness. Stubbornness feeds only when luck sits at your table, Skard returned, yet there was no heat in it. He lifted his hand again, as if saluting a cairn on a familiar road. If we meet on a ledger, we will write the numbers clean. If we meet on a field, may the mud be soft. If we meet on a beach, may the tide favour the bold. Eric nodded, and that was the end of it. Oars slid out. The two ships eased apart without clamour, as if pressed by invisible hands back into their separate grooves. The moment did not break, it thinned, stretched, and then was simply behind you, the way a wave is yours, and then the seas again. When the distance was a breath and then a dozen, Ketil blew air through his teeth. I've seen him once at Hafri's market, he said. Sells truth like sailcloth, sturdy until a storm. Old Arnor scratched at his beard. Even stormcloth keeps the first rain off, he muttered, which might have been agreement. Rani plucked a thoughtful string and let it fade. You kept your shield at the rail a while longer, not from fear, but because the weight felt right there, as if the ship were a body, and you a muscle holding it properly. Skade's warning rattled in your chest like a bead in a gourd. The horn from last night paired with it, a sound remembered by the skin more than the ear. You poured the thoughts into motion. Helping set the sail, trimming when Eirik's hand flicked, coiling lines with deliberate neatness, so that if you had to grab them in haste later, they would reward you for the earlier care. The wind freshened, taking your longship by the shoulder and urging it forward with a companionable shove. The coast unrolled like cloth from a bolt, ridges and coves, patches of scrub, an occasional scatter of sheep, no larger than bits of wool caught on a hedge. The sun leaned west, gilding the hollows and turning the shallows to plates of glass where sand ribs showed like the skeleton of a sleeping thing. By late day, Eirik pointed with 2 fingers toward a low river mouth where reeds cut the water into green seams. Shelter, he said, and perhaps tongues that talk of things we need to know. You felt the ship relax a little, the way a horse does when it scents it's stable. Oars came out to mind your entry, the sail ghosted down, and you slipped between reed walls into a channel, cool and secret after the bright sea. The river made a bend that hid the world. Birdsong replaced gull cry. Insects stitched lines in the air. On a sandy spit just inside the bend, 3 youths stood with spears too long for their arms and the iron confidence of their age. Their hair was sun-bleached, their feet black with mud. They did not raise the spears. They only watched, jaws set as if hung from hooks. Arik lifted his open hands. "We come to trade words and bread," he called, letting the words go no faster than the current. "If we offend your rules, tell us before we step on their tails." An older man emerged from behind a willow, his cloak patched with care, his eyes careful. He had the look of someone who had learned to count strangers and keep the sum small. "Words cost lies, which we cannot afford," he replied, which was as neat a test as any. "Bread we have sparingly, but a little salt can stretch it." Rani stepped forward and set his lyre on his knee where all could see. "We have songs," he offered. "They make bread taste longer." The older man considered this odd coin with the seriousness of a man looking at an unfamiliar measure. Finally, he nodded toward a low curve of bank where mooring would not tear grass roots. "Tie light," he said. "If the river wishes you gone, we will not wrestle her." On shore, the settlement showed itself as 6 huts set back among alders, their roofs weighted with stones against winter's hands. Chickens worked the dirt like scribes. A dog loped near and stopped with one forepaw held aloft, casting judgment with his nose. Women came from doorways with the particular look of those who carry homes in their hands, a little weary, always balancing something fragile and necessary. Children stared and then, as children do, forgot to be afraid when Rani made his strings chuckle like a river chuckle answering back. You helped carry a keg to a flat stone that would serve as a table. Eric spoke with the older man, whose name turned out to be Vidar, about water depth, about who had passed and when, about rumours that grow on reed banks as easily as ripples. Vidar told of riders inland who wore iron hats and counted sheep with the same eyes they turned on women. He told of a man with a scar pulling his lip who had offered to sell protection and then tested the price of refusal. He told finally of 2 nights ago when mist came up river like a stranger and the horn sounded from it. Not a call to gather, but a low, patient note that made even the dog hide his face. At that, the air seemed to cool despite the late light. One of the youths with the long spear snorted as if to show he feared only a poor dinner, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the shaft. Eric asked quiet questions. How long? How many times? What shape did the mist make when it moved? Vidar answered as best a man can describe a feeling that wears fog for a cloak. While they spoke, you sat with the women, your hands busy with a net, mending that did not need a warrior's grip, but appreciated a careful one. One of them, with hair the colour of river mud and a manner brisk as a brisk wind, watched your fingers knot and smiled without showing teeth. "You make a good stitch," she said. "Good stitches hold fish and sometimes hold people together." "My mother taught me," you said. "She says thread is a kind of promise." The woman grunted approvingly at that. "Then I hope you carry many promises," she replied, then glanced toward the men at their quieter talk. "And that you keep them when the fog is thick." As dusk pooled beneath the alders, Rani set his lyre across his lap and sang a song low enough that the river could weave it into itself without fuss. The settlement breathed easier by degrees, like a tight belt loosened. You tasted their relief in the way laughter came, brief, surprised, grateful not to belong only to trouble. Bread was shared, thin but enough. A pair of small fish were roasted on green sticks, their bellies splitting with a faint hiss that made your mouth flood. There was no great decision then, no pledge sworn over steel, only the little choices of evening, to coil one rope neatly instead of letting it sprawl, to keep one's boots close to hand, to set a second watch though the reeds seemed harmless. When you lay down near the ship's prow, back cushioned by your rolled cloak and the day's labour humming dully in your bones, you listened to the river fold itself under stars and thought of Skadi's warning and Vidar's horn. Between them, A narrow path ran like a deer track through scrub, and you understood a little more why seafarers cultivate patience the way farmers cultivate grain. Somewhere an owl took up the night's first question, asked it once, again and again, as if the asking itself was a kind of safety. Your eyes closed on the soft green darkness. You slept with one hand not far from your shield, and your dreams full of water that did not threaten so much as wait, old and exacting, for those who knew how to move with it. The morning came quiet, as if the river had laid a soft palm on the settlement and told it to rest. Mist pooled low among the alders, curling like the breath of something sleeping. Your cloak was beaded with dew when you rose, shaking it out over the grass. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth, and somewhere in the reeds a heron barked its harsh, sudden cry before lifting into the pale sky. Eric was already awake, crouched by the flat stone, where he had spread a small scrap of sailcloth. On it lay a map, more suggestion than precision, its coastlines drawn in a hand that had trusted memory more than measurement. His finger traced a line southward, where the river mouth gave back to the open sea. Ketil stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes on the mist rather than the map. Hrani, still chewing a strip of dried meat, looked over Eirik's shoulder without comment. Vidar approached them with a small basket in hand, flatbread wrapped in leaves, a few smoked river fish, and a little clay pot of something dark and fragrant. "For the road," he said simply. "No coin needed. You've brought news enough and a song to wash it down." Eirik accepted the basket with a nod. "We may pass this way again. Keep your watchmen sharp. Horns in the fog are not a friend's greeting." Vidar's jaw tightened. "We'll remember." Then, after a moment, he added, "And if you hear that call again, don't look for the shore it comes from. The water will seem safe until it isn't." It was not in Eirik's nature to promise retreat, so he said nothing. But you caught the flicker of understanding in his eyes, the kind that weighs a man's words and sets them aside for the right moment. You helped push the longship from the muddy bank, the cold water curling briefly over your boots before receding. The reeds whispered against the hull as you slipped back into the current, and soon the settlement was nothing but a low blur behind you. The river's mouth opened slowly, like a door reluctant to let you pass. Then the horizon spread wide again, the sky unbroken but for the thin ribs of cloud in the east. The wind favoured you that morning, a steady pull that filled the sail without straining it. The ship moved with a kind of ease. The oarlocks quiet, the water along the hull breaking in small, regular sighs. Hrani sat near the prow, plucking at his lyre with an idle hand, shaping half-melodies that never quite became songs. The men spoke little. The river's warning still clung to them, invisible but felt, the way a chill lingers in a room long after the fire has gone out. By midday the coastline changed. The low hills grew steeper, their faces furrowed with stone and heather. You passed a narrow beach where a pair of seals lay sprawled like great, drowsy stones, their heads lifting only briefly at your passing. Beyond that, the land curved inward, forming a sheltered bay where the water lay dark and still. Eirik steered clear of it, keeping to the deeper line where the wind still carried you. "Too quiet," he murmured, half to himself. "Quiet bays are where trouble likes to sleep." Ketil spat over the side. "And wake up hungry." The sail held its shape until late afternoon, when the wind faltered. The oars came out, the leather loops creaking as each man found his rhythm. You took your place beside Ketil, the weight of the oar familiar now, the push and pull settling into your bones. The sun dropped toward the sea, gilding the ripples until they looked like molten metal spilling away from the blade's edge. It was during this golden hour that you saw it. Far ahead, at the very rim of sight, a shape moved, long and low, with a single mast like a dark needle against the sky. It was too far to make out its colours, but something in the way it cut the water pricked your attention. Ketil noticed too. "There," he said softly, nodding toward it without pausing his stroke. Eric's gaze followed, his face unreadable. "Hold course," he ordered, but his voice had the tautness of a bowstring. As the light bled from the day, the distance between you closed slowly. The other vessel's sail was furled, and it moved under oars alone, its pace deliberate. You counted them, 10 to a side, each dipping and rising with the precision of drilled men. The prow was carved, though you could not yet see into what shape, and the timbers shone with fresh pitch. The air cooled quickly with the fading sun. A thin veil of mist began to gather over the water, not thick enough to hide in, but enough to blur the edges of things. The sight of it made your stomach tighten. You remembered the horn, the way sound had lived inside the fog like a patient thing. "Shields ready," Eirik said quietly. The command rolled down the benches without urgency, but with the gravity of habit. You slid yours into place, feeling the familiar weight against your arm, the leather grip fitting your hand as if it had always been meant for it. The other ship did not change course. Its prow's carving emerged slowly from the dimming light, an open-mouthed beast with curling fangs, something between a wolf and a serpent. The oars dipped in unbroken unison, each splash landing like a single heartbeat. When it came close enough for faces to be guessed but not known, the mist thickened just a fraction, enough to dim the world's edges. Then the sound came, not a horn, but the low, rolling thrum of a drum. Slow, patient, the kind of beat that does not hurry because it believes the night will last as long as it needs. The men at the oars rowed to that rhythm, their bodies swaying in perfect time. No one on your ship spoke now. Even Rani's lyre was silent, his hands resting flat on the wood as if to keep it still. The two ships drew closer, neither slowing nor quickening, until the space between them was a line you could have crossed in 6 strides. Then the drumming stopped. From the other ship, a single voice carried over the water, deep, rough, and speaking words you did not know. They rolled like old stones, heavy and deliberate, and though you could not understand them, the tone was not a question. Eirik's reply was short, sharp in the tongue of the coast south of here. You had never heard him use it before. The other voice answered, softer now, but with the weight of something decided. Without warning, the oars of the other vessel lifted and stilled. Yours did the same at Eirik's signal. For a moment, the ships drifted side by side in the mist, their crews watching one another in the half-light. Then, as if some silent agreement had been reached, the other ship's oars dipped again, and it pulled away. Not turning, not rushing, only sliding forward until the fog swallowed its carved beast's head and the sound of its passage faded into nothing. Eric's shoulders eased, but only slightly. "Row," he said at last, and the rhythm of your oars began again, carrying you forward into a night that seemed to listen more than it breathed. Night settled like a cloak soaked in salt, heavy but somehow comforting once your shoulders accepted the weight. The sea drew its slow breath and let it out again, the kind of breathing a sleeper does when the dreams are not troubling. Your hands remembered the oar even when they rested, tendons faintly pulsing as if some inland river still ran under your skin. The mist never quite thickened into the blankness of the other night. Instead it hung like gauze, thinning here, gathering there, a shifting veil that made distance uncertain and time a little elastic. On deck, oilcloth rustled, a spear butt clicked once against a thwart, and then quiet fell back into place as if the ship herself was curating silence. Eirik divided the night watch, and yours came in the deepest band of darkness, the hour when men often feel the shape of their thoughts as if they were stones in a pocket. Before then, you lay beneath your cloak and looked up at the torn clouds, counting the windows where stars peered through. Rani breathed near your feet, a low, steady rasp, hands clasped over his lyre, as if even in sleep he feared the sea might take it. Kittil slept with his mouth slightly open, face turned toward the mast, a man accustomed to waking at the slightest shift of wood or wind. Old Arnor lay on his side as if listening to the bilge talk, one ear to the planks, the cartilage battered by decades of weather and still attentive. When Eirik touched your shoulder for watch, he used only 2 fingers, a pressure that belonged to the sea as much as to him. You rose without words, easing from your cloak, leaving its warmth reluctantly, like stepping out of a memory. The cold gripped your cheeks at once, clean, insistent, honest. You took your place near the bow where the world arrives first, and looked into a darkness that had texture, the dim sheen of low swells, the faint seam where sky and water pretended to part. Nothing dramatic happened. That was its own sort of tension. You stood with the shield at your leg and the seeks warm where it pressed your thigh, and you learned the work of watching, not letting imagination eat the edges of what is true, not chasing every tiny sound into a story with teeth. When the sea slapped an odd double-tongued smack against the strakes, you traced it to the angle of drift and wind. When a huff came out of nowhere, you nearly flinched until the smooth cylinder of a porpoise's back laced the surface in a wet loop, gone again before your breath had finished leaving you. To stay awake, you moved the way a thread moves, unobtrusive, steady, checking lashings, laying your palm on the mast to feel its minute tremble, whispering to yourself the names of knots in your mother's voice. A star loosened itself from the sky and slid to the horizon, a slow ember with no heat. You murmured a line of thanks to whatever listened when men made small bargains in large places. The fog receded a little more. One by one, the nearer stars drew nearer still, as if the night had decided you were not a threat and could share a portion of its private shine. Toward the end of your watch, a shape appeared ahead. A low, dark rumple that could have been a boulder or a sleeping beast, then resolved into a skerry where waves gnawed the edges with patient teeth. Seabirds huddled there, heads tucked backward, their bodies small mounds of moon pale. The ship sighed past without waking them. You felt that you and they were both allowed here on sufferance. Dawn came grudgingly, reluctant to part the curtains. The first light was a bruised colour, tender mottlings of blue and mauve stitched with long threads of pearl. When the sun finally pushed a clean edge above the seam of the world, it cut the mist to ribbons that snagged briefly on the mast and then drifted free. The sea flattened to a long satin and the wind forgot its own name, leaving you to oars again. The men woke in murmurs and yawns, the smell of damp wool and old smoke rising like a tribe in itself. Eric offered a short word. South. It meant everything it needed to mean. Catil pressed half a piece of flatbread into your hand, and you ate mechanically, grain and salt and a ghost of caraway, each chew putting a point back on your attention. Rani drank from a skin and wiped his beard with the back of a thumb. If today were a dog, he said mildly, it would be a patient one, waiting by a door that hasn't opened yet. No one answered, but you saw the small smile in Eirik's eyes as he turned to study the colour of the water, searching for that greenish note which tells of shallows and, occasionally, trouble. Around mid-morning, the sea took on that different tone, not in sight but in sound. The ship made a slightly higher whisper along her forward planks, as if the water were thinner. Eirik shifted course a hair, and the whisper squared itself into a friendlier shush. Gulls appeared in desultory twos and threes, circling not you but some distant intention. Ahead, the coastline firmed into cliffs with seams like old scars. Between two such scars, a tongue of sand lay thrust out, suggesting refuge. You made for it, but not carelessly. Oars bit and held you in a measured approach while old Arnor stood at the prow, a lead line in his fist. He sang the soundings in a half-tune that made numbers feel older. 5, 4 good, 3.5, 3. The water cleared, turning that bottle green of river mouths. Your nostrils caught the scent before your eyes did. Peat, wet bark, a trace of wood smoke that wasn't your own. Eric raised a palm and you eased. The ship forged gently into the river's first broadening. On the left bank, hidden at first by willows, a small hall revealed itself. No proud Jarl's house, but something with pride anyway. Walls of plank and turf, roof hacked close against wind, a carved post at the door that had once been a man's face, but now looked like weather thinking. A few smaller houses crouched around it like chicks near a hen. People stood, did not wave. That they stood at all meant the world here had not dissolved entirely into fear. Dogs barked in two tones, one shrill with habit, one deep with meaning. Eric signalled to hold midstream, his voice carried, comfortable as daylight. We seek news and bread to match ours. We bring nothing you cannot count in both hands. From the bank stepped a woman with a child on her hip and a long knife at her belt. Her hair was bound in two tight braids that told you she did not give wind or chance any purchase. Bread is counted differently on different days, she called back. Whose ship are you? Eric's, he replied. From the north of North, where the sea bites harder and men are stubborn enough to chew back. Then you are not the men with the horn. The child hid his face in her cloak at that last word, as if it were a name with teeth. We are the men who avoid it, Eric said, when we can. She shifted the child and glanced along your benches, taking stock the way one looks at the weather and at a stranger's hands. "Tie there," she said at last, pointing to a cut in the bank where poles waited like unfriendly fingers. "Light. If the river wants you gone, we don't wrestle her, and neither should you." You moored with the care it deserved. Stepping ashore carried a thrill like stepping onto a new chapter, familiar shapes, dirt, hearth, door, but words you had not read yet. The woman's name was Svanhild. Up close her eyes were the colour of wet stone, steady without being cold. She told you her husband was away inland trading for iron nails that did not break, and news that did. "He was to return yesterday," she said simply, and in her tone was the flake of worry that makes truth sharp. "Our boys have watched the ridge since dawn." You saw one of those boys now, lanky and attempting manhood, his spear as long as the fear he kept pressed quiet beneath his ribs. He pretended to ignore your ship while watching everything about it. Eric gave the ritual offer: salt, an extra pair of hands, a song if they wanted it, and Svanhild weighed each like weights on a balance. In the end, she nodded you toward a bench near the hall's door. "Sit," she said. "We'll trade warmth for word. If your captain lies, I keep your oars." The child peeked over her cloak edge, thumb in mouth, bold and frightened together. Inside, heat pooled from a hearth where peat glowed like a red memory. The hall smelled of smoke, damp wool, and the tenderness that clings to places where children sleep. Shields hung along one wall, not many and some old, but cared for. A woven tapestry draped the far end, its patterns more river than dragon, the patient kind of art made in small hours. Bread came, coarse and dense, and a stew where onion and fish leaned into each other kindly. You ate as travellers eat when they know every mouthful is a promise not to waste the giver's trust. Between spoonfuls, Eirik asked about the horn, and Svanhild answered in small circles, cautious of saying more than the room should hold. "It isn't one ship," she said finally. "It is a habit. They sound the horn when the mist collects, and sometimes they come silently to test if fear has grown fatter. Once they took sheep. Once they took a woman's son for a night and returned him with his eyes made of glass. He speaks now only to dogs." Her jaw set not dramatically, just firmly, in a way that said she had ground her grief to powder and used it as chalk to mark her days. Ketil's knuckles whitened on his bowl. Old Arnor's gaze slid to you, then away, as if the ship had tilted a degree that needed no comment. Rani sat with his lyre untuned, the strings slack, as if tightening them would tighten something else he wasn't ready to hear sing. When the meal ended, Svanhild took you outside to the line where the river grass gives way to packed earth. She gestured downstream. The mouth changes with every season. Sandbars move like sleepy cattle. If you leave at dusk, the fog will have nowhere to sit and you may slide by with only the sea's attention on you. If you leave now, the horn will not bother to chase. It rarely does in honest daylight. She looked at the sky as if reading a mood. "But my boy, Folkmar will not come down from the ridge if his father hasn't returned by noon, and noon is past." The words came plain. Asking hasn't always a question mark. "If you would send 2 men to walk as far as the ash grove and back, they would either meet him or find news enough to bring me out of not knowing." Eric glanced your way. He didn't need to speak. You felt the tug in your chest answer before your mouth did. Ketil had already stood, rolling his shoulders as if to put on an old habit. "I know the tread of reed ground," he said, "and she has stitches in her hands," nodding at you, "for mending what we might tear." Svanhild's eyes rested on you, not unkind. "You carry a shield like someone who remembers what it's for," she said. "Go if you will. The ash grove is a thumb of land that sticks itself where river and marsh argue. If you come to the split stone, you have gone too far or not far enough, depending on what you seek." You buckled your shield, slung your seeks, checked the smaller knife at your boot that your mother had taught you to forget until you needed to remember it. Eric laid a palm briefly on your shoulder. Light, the way a blessing is when a hand knows the weight of steel too well to make more of it. "Go and return," he said. "If you see the fog stand up, crouch lower than it." You and Ketil set off along the river's left bank. The ground there was stitched with deer tracks and the twining signatures of waterfowl. The sun had hauled itself well clear by then, and in its honest light the reeds were bright, tips beaded with the last of the night's wet. Dragonflies wrote quick blue verses over puddles. Somewhere a snipe drummed, that strange airborne beating like a goatskin drum the size of a hand. You walked without chatter. Words spend a person in the wrong ways when moving through land that belongs to listening. The hall receded until it was an idea behind you, and the ship a promise of return you carried like a token in your pocket. Kettle kept his eyes moving. Water, ground, sky, your face. Every so often he tapped his thigh with 2 fingers, the rhythm of a remembered oar stroke that kept his muscles honest. The ash grove announced itself by scent first, the clean green of leaves that choose wind as a friend, and the faint sour of damp bark. The trees stood with their feet in black soil, toes spread, the way old men stand to take pressure off their backs. There, at the edge where grass gives up to root, you found tracks, the purposeful drag of a small cart, a man's boot prints turned outward slightly from years of walking with a burden, and the overlay of a second set fresher by a few hours. Light, quick, the impatience of a young man told to watch and wanting to run. Kettle crouched, laid his palm near these signs without touching. Folkmar, he said, and his father's wheels. The wheels turned at the sausage stone, and then... He squinted toward the line where fog liked to sleep. The day was bright, but even bright days have places that look left behind. And then the river asked for a gift, or someone asked on its behalf. You did not speak. Instead, you put your shield down gently and listened with your feet, the way your father taught you on the fishing rocks, feeling not for water, but for the tremble of disturbance that lingers in ground for a while after something abrupt has passed. There was a sense of brokenness here that was not the natural breaking of branch under deer hooves. It was cleaner, crueler, as if cut by iron that did not know regret. The ash leaves made their small, determined sound in the mild wind. Far off, a dog barked twice, paused, barked once, a pattern. You and Kettle looked at each other and began to move, not running, but thinning yourselves into the reeds, stepping where earth looked trustworthy, breathing shallow so your hearts would not be too loud for hearing what waited ahead. The reeds ahead trembled, though the wind was a lazy thing just then. Kettle's hand lifted in a small, sharp gesture, and you stopped, easing your weight into your heels so the ground would take you as lightly as it could. The dog's bark had stopped altogether now, leaving the kind of silence that isn't truly quiet, but thick with things not said. You let your breath settle, the air cool in your nose, the taste of the river's damp in your mouth. A moment later, a figure rose from the grass ahead, a boy, thin as a young willow, with hair like pale straw and eyes wide enough to swallow half the world. He had a spear in his hands, though it was angled more toward the ground than toward any threat. Recognition softened Kettle's posture. "Folkmar," he called softly, "your mother's been watching the ridge for you." The boy's gaze flicked from Kettle to you, as if measuring the shape of your armor and the set of your stance. Then his shoulders dropped a little, and the tightness in his jaw loosened enough to let out a breath. "You're from the ship," he said, and the words carried both relief and a thread of something else, something caught in the teeth of fear. "Your father?" Kettle asked, voice level. Folkmar glanced behind him, toward the deeper bend of the river where the reeds grew tall enough to hide an elk. "He's there," he said finally. "The cart broke an axle at the edge of the mud. We tried to pull it free, but then..." His words faded and his eyes shifted again, not toward the cart, but toward the water's slow gleam beyond. You could smell it now, a faint taint under the good, clean scents of marsh and leaf. It was iron, but not the iron of tools, the iron of blood gone cool. "Show us," you said, your voice quieter than you meant it to be. Folkmar hesitated, the boy still wrestling with the man he was trying to become. Then he nodded once and turned, leading you through a weaving path in the reeds. Kettle followed in silence, his eyes never still, and you brought up the rear, your shield turned slightly outward, your seeks loose in your grip. The mud claimed the first boot step you took beyond the grove, pulling with that slow insistence that makes you think it is harmless until it has you to the ankle. Ahead, the cart leaned at a sorry angle, one wheel sunk deep, the other twisted and half off its hub. A bundle of goods sat half hidden under a draped canvas, sacks, a small barrel, a stack of what looked like cured hides. Beside it, slumped against the cart's frame, was a man. His head rested awkwardly on his chest. His hair matted where the crown met the neck. You moved faster then, the reeds hissing against your thighs. Folkmar went with you, but Ketil caught his shoulder before he could get too close. You dropped to a knee beside the man. His breath was gone, but his body had not yet fully stiffened. A clean wound lay under the hairline, just above the ear. A single strike, quick and certain. Whoever had done it had known how to make a man fall without noise. His hands were empty, but his belt showed the marks where a knife and pouch had been torn away. You pulled the canvas back further, scanning the goods. Some had been rifled through, but much was left untouched. This was not a simple robbery. The barrel's seal was broken, and when you nudged the lid aside, the smell of fish oil rose strong. Valuable to a trader, but nothing worth killing a man over unless the killing had another purpose. "Tracks," Ketil murmured, pointing to the mud beyond the cart. Broad boot prints, heavier than Folkmar's, pressed into the wet earth. The tread was unfamiliar, not the smooth soles of river folk, nor the thick hobnails of inland farmers. The pattern was cross-hatched, a style you'd seen before on the decks of ships where a firm grip was needed. 3 men, maybe 4, Ketil judged. No horses. They came from the water and went back the same way. You followed the line of his gesture to where the reeds thinned and the river showed itself again. The mud there was churned with the flat scoops of oar blades. "They came in quiet," you said, "and left just as quiet," Ketil added. Folkmar stood stiff, his hands white on the shaft of his spear. "I tried to lift him," he said suddenly, the words spilling too fast, "but he was heavy and I thought, if they came back—" His voice broke, though he tried to swallow the sound. "You did what you should," Ketil said firmly. "If you'd stayed, you'd be lying beside him." You rose, scanning the water. It moved as it always did, slow, brown-green, wearing its secrets without hurry. Yet you felt the same prickle along your neck that you'd felt in the fog 2 nights before. The river was holding its breath again. Ketil caught your glance and nodded once. "We take the boy and what we can carry. The rest stays for now. If we try to drag that cart out, we'll be here when the wrong ears hear about it." You helped Folkmar shoulder a sack, while Ketil took the small barrel. Together, you stepped back into the reeds, leaving the cart leaning in its slow surrender to the mud. The boy glanced over his shoulder once, his mouth tight, and you knew that the image of his father, slumped in that half-light, would follow him for longer than the path home. By the time you reached the edge of the ash grove, the sun had shifted enough to cast long bars of shadow through the leaves. The air felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of what you'd seen. Ketil set the barrel down and rested a hand on Folkmar's shoulder. "When we tell your mother," he said, "we tell it straight, but we tell it on your terms." The boy only nodded, the spear still in his grip. You kept your eyes moving as you walked the last stretch back. The river's surface lay smooth, but every ripple looked like it might be the first word of something larger. Somewhere upstream a heron cried, and in that sharp, lonely sound you heard again the low thrum of a drum and the breath of a horn inside the fog. Svanhild saw you before you stepped from the reeds. She was standing in the doorway of the hall, the child on her hip, the older boy still on the ridge with his spear angled toward the sky. Her face did not change when she saw the bundle over your shoulder or the small barrel in Ketil's arms. She only looked for the one who was not with you. Folkmar walked ahead, his spear balanced across both hands like a burden he wasn't sure how to set down. He stopped just outside the threshold. The space between them filled with a silence so taut you felt it in your own bones. Then he spoke, not quickly, not stumbling, telling her what had happened in the ash grove, in the reeds, at the river's edge. He told her about the cart, the broken axle, the stranger's tracks, and the wound that had made his father's head hang like a grain sack on its rope. His voice held until the last few words, when it frayed, but he finished them anyway. Svanhild shifted the child on her hip without taking her eyes from her son. "You did not fall with him," she said, her voice steady as an oar stroke. "That means you did well. It means you will see tomorrow." She reached out, set her hand briefly on the side of his head, then took the spear from him and leaned it against the wall. Only then did she look to you and Ketil. "Thank you," she said. There was no ceremony in it, just the plain fact of someone who understood the weight of carrying bad news home. Inside the hall, The air felt heavier than before. Rani sat cross-legged by the hearth, fingers moving lightly over his lyre, though no sound came. Eirik stood near the door, his gaze sliding to you as soon as you entered. You gave him the short version, the tracks, the oar marks in the mud, the goods left behind. His jaw set slightly at the part about the wound. They weren't there for the cart, Kettle said. They were there for him, or for the road itself. Eirik nodded slowly. Men who leave half the load behind either took all they wanted or were made to leave in a hurry. Neither sits well. Rani finally plucked a single note, letting it hang. And the boy, he asked. We'll stand another day, you said. That's all that matters now. The evening meal was subdued. Bread was broken, fish shared, but the low murmur of talk never rose above the sound of the fire. You caught Svanhild watching her eldest son more than once, as if memorizing the way his shoulders moved, the angle of his head when he leaned to speak. Folkmar ate without haste, his eyes fixed on the bread in his hands. When the light began to thin, Eirik gathered the crew at the ship. We leave before full dark, he said. The river mouth is safer in fading light than in rising fog. We'll take the south current and keep to the wind's shadow. If the horn sounds, we do not turn to greet it. Svanhild came to the bank as you pushed off. She carried no torch, only stood with her son beside her, the younger child pressed against her leg. Her hand lifted once, palm outward, and you returned the gesture with your own. The image held in your mind as the reeds closed around the ship and the bend took her from sight. The river's current carried you faster than the oars alone could manage. The sound of water against the hull became a steady companion, low and smooth. The banks on either side darkened into shapes you knew only by their outlines. Willow, alder, the occasional ash standing like a sentinel. Halfway to the mouth, the first threads of mist began to curl over the water. They were faint at first, no more than the breath of the evening cooling the river's skin, but you felt the memory of that other night settle between your shoulder blades. The crew rowed in silence, each man's eyes on the line ahead where the channel opened to the sea. It was there, just before the river widened, that the sound came. Not the horn this time, but the drum. Slow, measured, the kind of rhythm that does not ask you to come closer but assumes you will. Every oar in the water hesitated, caught between stroke and stillness. Eirik's voice came low but firm. Row, steady. The mist thickened with every length you gained toward open water. Shapes moved in it, tall, narrow shadows that could have been reeds, could have been masts. The drumbeat carried differently here, bouncing off the fog so it seemed to come from all directions at once. You tightened your grip on your shield, the leather warm under your fingers. Then, just as the current began to pull you into the tide's embrace, a darker shape resolved ahead. A ship, half swallowed by the mist. Its sail was furled, but oars dipped with the same unhurried precision you had seen before. The prow's carving, wolf or serpent, watched you with open jaws. Eirik did not alter course. His eyes stayed fixed on the strip of water between you and the open sea. The drumbeat slowed, as if matching your pace, then stopped altogether. The other vessel did not close the distance. It turned slightly, enough to keep its prow facing you, and let the river carry it backward into the mist until only the curve of its carved jaw remained, and then even that was gone. When the sea opened before you, the wind was there waiting, cool and clean. The sail took it eagerly, and the river fell away behind you. But the echo of that drumbeat stayed in your chest, as steady as your own heartbeat, refusing to fade with the fog. The sea felt wider after the river, as if you had stepped from a narrow room into a vast, cold hall. The wind held steady, filling the sail so that the longship leaned into its course like a hound taking a scent. Salt replaced the damp sweetness of the marsh, and the air's bite was cleaner here, though it carried the faint whisper of something left behind in the fog. The crew settled into their quiet work. Some checked lashings, others coiled lines or adjusted their gear. Rani tuned his lyre by feel, plucking notes that disappeared almost as soon as they were born, letting them sink into the wind. Kettle sat near you, sharpening the edge of his seeks with slow, even strokes. The rasp of stone on steel matched the rhythm of the waves under the hull. Eirik stood at the steerboard, his gaze sweeping from horizon to horizon. Every so often he glanced behind, though the fog had long since thinned into tatters. His hand rested lightly on the tiller, not because the wind demanded it, but because a captain's place is with the helm when the day's intentions are still uncertain. You watched the coast unroll to starboard, a low spine of land, rocky in places, softened elsewhere by heather and grass that clung stubbornly against the salt air. Here and there you caught glimpses of inlets, narrow and deep, the kind of places that could hide a ship if it knew the tides. By midday the wind shifted slightly westward, enough to bring a sharper edge to the cold. The sail shivered once before finding its new shape, and the longship's motion changed, a subtle difference that you felt more than saw. Eric adjusted the course with a flick of the tiller. "We'll keep close enough to see land," he said, "but not so close we scrape our belly on someone's welcome." The afternoon wore on with the steady patience of the sea. You found yourself slipping into that half-aware state that comes with long hours under sail, your eyes tracing the water, your hands resting but ready, your thoughts wandering like gulls on a current. You thought of Haldrek, of the grove painted on your shield, of your mother's hands guiding thread through wool. You thought, too, of the boy Folkmar, and the way his voice had not broken when he told his mother the truth. It was near dusk when you spotted the sail. A pale triangle far ahead, low on the horizon, just at the point where the sea's colour begins to drink the last of the day's light. It moved steadily, not hurried, as if confident in its course. Eric saw it too. He did not change speed or heading, only watched. The wind freshened as the light thinned, and with it came the scent of burning wood, faint but distinct, carried far across the water. Somewhere ahead, or perhaps along the unseen shore, someone had lit a fire large enough for the sea to taste. The pale sail grew fractionally larger against the bruising sky. By the time the first stars began to show, the other vessel had drawn close enough for you to see that its sail was patched in places, darker cloth stitched into lighter. Its hull rode low in the water, heavy with either cargo or men. No oars showed, only the slow, deliberate pull of the wind. Eirik called for shields to be set along the gunwale, not raised in defence but placed where they could be taken up in an instant. The crew moved without chatter, each man sliding into his place. You felt the familiar curve of your own shield against your arm and the solid comfort of its weight. As the ships closed the distance, the scent of smoke strengthened. You caught, too, the faint sound of voices, many, though none raised above the wind's murmur. Then the ship angled slightly, enough that you could see her side. Blackened streaks marred the planks amidships, the kind fire leaves when it licks but does not consume. She drew nearer still, and a voice hailed you across the water. It was a woman's, clear, carrying, with the kind of command that needed no shouting. The words were in the coastal tongue, offering greeting and asking your captain's name. Eric answered in kind, giving her both his name and the truth that he came from the far north. A pause followed, and then she called again. "If your ship carries hands for work and hearts for steadiness, we may have use for both." The gap between the vessels narrowed to the length of a spear throw. In the deepening dusk, you could see her now at the other helm, a tall woman with hair braided back from her face, the rest bound in a knot high on her head. Her shoulders were broad beneath a weathered cloak, and at her hip hung a sword with a grip wrapped in pale leather. Eirik did not answer at once. He watched her ship, the men and women moving on its deck, the way they carried themselves. Then he said, "The sea decides where we go, but we'll hear your need." She inclined her head slightly. "There's a bay 2 hours south where the tide leaves wrecks for those quick enough to claim them. Tonight, something's washed in that isn't driftwood or bones. We'll take it if no other hands reach first. But the horn has been heard in the fog there, and some of my crew have seen the ship that follows it." Her eyes slid to you for the briefest moment before returning to Eirik. "If you've heard it too, you know why I ask." The words seemed to hang between the two ships, weighty as the evening air. The wind pressed at the sails, urging both vessels onward. The smell of smoke lingered, and somewhere in the dark ahead, the sea shifted its voice, as if making room for something else to speak. The two ships held pace with each other, riding the same wind, as if tethered by something unseen. The woman at the other helm, she had not given her name yet, kept her eyes on Eirik, the sort of steady, measuring look you'd seen from fighters before a bout. The distance between hulls was close enough now that you could read the grain of her ship's planks, patched and tarred in places where the sea had once bitten too deep. Eirik tilted his head slightly, neither agreeing nor refusing. "This bay, does it have a name?" he asked. "A few," she answered. "None friendly. My people call it Stormhand because the tides there take hold as if they mean to keep you. Others call it Crow's Table. The wrecks feed both." Her gaze shifted briefly to the horizon ahead, where the last smear of daylight was fading into the kind of grey that hides distance. 2 hours if the wind stays loyal, less if it's eager. Rani spoke then, his voice quiet but carrying. "And if the horn comes through that fog, do you stay to fight, or do you take your prize and run?" The woman's expression did not change. "I don't fight shadows. I'll fight ships if they're fool enough to show their hulls." She glanced toward the blackened streaks along her own ship's side, then back to Eirik. "This isn't a quarrel I choose, but if they mean to take what's mine, they'll pay for it in splinters and blood." Eirik was silent for a long moment, the wind snapping gently at his cloak. Then he said, "We'll sail with you as far as the bay. After that, the sea will choose the rest." A faint smile crossed her face, brief, almost private. "Then you'll need to match our pace." She lifted a hand, signalling to her crew. Oars slid into place, dipping in slow unison to coax her ship ahead without losing the wind. Your own crew took up the rhythm without command. The two ships moved together, their wakes crossing and parting like the weaving of a loose braid. The sky deepened above, the first stars peering through where the clouds thinned. The smell of smoke lingered, joined now by the faint tang of seaweed stirred by an unseen current. Kettle rode beside you, his breathing easy, his eyes on the dark line where the sea met the coming night. "Stormhand," he murmured. "I've heard of it. Tides there will spin you until you forget which way is out. And yet we're going," you said. His mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's because sometimes what the tide brings in is worth the risk of being turned around." The coastline to starboard grew more jagged as you sailed. Black cliffs rose in places, their bases foamed white where waves broke and retreated. In the deepening dark you began to catch the glow of fires. Small, scattered, some perhaps the hearths of fishing huts, others signal blazes meant for eyes at sea. The woman's ship kept slightly ahead now, leading you into waters that felt narrower than they looked. An hour passed, maybe more. The air cooled further, and the wind took on a restless quality, shifting in small, quick breaths. You could feel the change in the longship's motion, less of the steady push, more of a tug sideways, as if the sea were reaching for the keel. Eirik adjusted the tiller, eyes fixed ahead where the woman's ship slipped between two low arms of land. As you passed into their shelter, the sound of the open sea softened, replaced by the deeper, more complex voice of water in a confined space. The moon, low and half hidden by cloud, cast a faint sheen on the bay. You saw at once why they called it Stormhand. The shoreline curved in 5 crooked inlets, each like a finger closing toward the center. Between them, the tide swirled in slow, like deliberate eddies. There were wrecks here, some bare ribs rising from the shallows, others nearly whole but sagging into the sand. Old timbers, pale where the salt had leached them clean, jutted from the water like bones. And in the center of it all, half submerged but unmistakable, lay the shape of something newly claimed by the sea. The woman's voice carried from her helm. "That's her. Came in with the morning tide. No colours flying when we found her, and no crew seen since." Even in the dim light, you could see the freshness of the wreck. The hull was still dark with pitch, the sail, what was left of it, hung in tatters but not yet shredded by time. The mast leaned, but had not snapped. The tide lapped at her side, pulling and releasing as if considering whether to take her fully. Eric's gaze flicked once around the bay, then back to the wreck. "We go in pairs," he said. "Half stay aboard to guard the ship. No one goes deeper into her without a line back here." The woman gave a short, approving nod. "Then we start before the tide changes her mind." You found yourself among the first chosen to board the wreck. The other crew's boat, a narrow skiff, was lowered into the water, rocking gently against the longship's side. You climbed down into it, your shield strapped tight to your back, Sikhs at your belt. Kettle joined you, along with 2 of the woman's people. A wiry man with a short axe and a broad-shouldered woman whose eyes seemed fixed on some point beyond the wreck. The oars dipped silently, the water here too busy with currents to reflect more than a smear of moonlight. As you drew closer, the smell of the wreck reached you, tar, wet wood, and the faint metallic tang of rust beginning its slow work. You could hear it too, the sound of the hull creaking as the tide shifted under her weight. It was not loud, but it carried far in the stillness of the bay. Somewhere in that creak, you thought you heard another sound, too soft to name, but enough to make the hairs on your neck rise. The skiff bumped lightly against the wreck's side, the sound dull against the sodden wood. Up close, she seemed larger than from a distance, her hull looming above you like the shadow of some beached creature. Seaweed trailed from her seams, caught in the jagged breaks where the tide had gnawed at her. The pitch along her planks was still tacky in places, as if she had been tarred not long before meeting her fate. Kettle steadied the skiff while the broad-shouldered woman, Inga, you'd learned her name was, caught hold of a frayed rope dangling over the side. She tested it once, twice, then nodded and began to climb, her boots finding what purchase they could against the wet hull. You followed, the rope rough and damp under your palms, your shield shifting against your back with each pull. The deck tilted under your weight, dipping slightly as the tide sloshed within the hull. The boards were slick with a film of algae and salt, forcing you to place each step carefully. The air here was thicker, brine, old fish, and something else beneath it, faint but unpleasant, a rot not yet given over to the sea. Inga moved ahead, her axe low, eyes scanning the shadows where the wreck's stern rose higher than the bow. Kettle joined you at your shoulder, his seeks loose in his hand. The wiry man from the other crew stayed near the rail, tying off the skiff's line and keeping watch over the water. You passed a tangle of rope and broken spar near the mast, the sail hanging in strips that whispered faintly with each stir of air. Footprints showed faintly in the grime on the deck. 2, maybe 3 sets. The tide had begun to wash them away, but you could see they led toward the companionway leading below. Kettle crouched briefly to touch one. "Hours old," he murmured, "not days." The hatch stood open, its edges scraped as if forced. From below came the slow drip of water, the sound echoing in the hollow space like the beating of a lazy heart. Inga gave a sharp tilt of her head toward it. You descended first, the steps slick under your boots. The dimness thickened here, the air close and smelling of wet timber. The water inside was ankle deep, rippling faintly as if something had moved through it not long ago. Crates and barrels lay scattered, some broken open, their contents half spilled into the brine, grain swelling into pulp, a coil of rope drifting like a sleeping snake. Then you saw him. He was slumped against the curve of the hull, head bowed, arms floating loosely in the shallow water. His clothes were dark with soaking, but the leather of his belt was still good, his boots sturdy. A gash marked the side of his head, dark and clean-edged, much like the wound you had seen on Folkmar's father. His eyes were closed, but his mouth hung slightly open, as if some last word had gone unspoken. Inga knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat. She shook her head once, the motion brisk, practical. "Not long dead," she said quietly, "but not a fresh kill either. Whoever did it is gone from here." The wiry man had joined you, his eyes darting around the dim hold. "Not gone far," he muttered. "Look." He pointed to a trail of disturbed water and scuffed wood leading toward the stern, where a small hatch stood ajar. Kettle moved to it and peered inside. "Empty," he said, but his tone lacked certainty. You crouched beside him, looking in. The space beyond was small, barely a crawl space, lined with racks where tools and spare rigging would have been kept. Now it held only shadows, and a faint mark scratched into the wood near the hatch. You leaned closer. It was a spiral, carved with a few quick cuts, shallow but deliberate. Inga saw it too. "I've seen that before," she said. "On a hull burned in the fjords 2 winters ago. No crew found then either." You straightened, the water swirling around your boots. "A mark of the ones who sound the horn?" you asked. Her eyes narrowed. "Or of something older that they serve?" The deck above creaked suddenly, not from the tide but from weight. Someone moving. Kettle's gaze shot upward, and without a word you and he were climbing back to the deck, the boards cold under your hands. When you broke into the open air, the night had settled fully, the bay dim under the clouded moon. The wind had died, leaving the water's surface strangely still. Near the bow, the skiff's line was slack against the rail. The wiry man was gone. Only the faint sound of oars dipping in water came from somewhere beyond the edge of the wreck. Kettle was the first to move, crossing the slick deck in long, careful strides toward the bow. You followed close, boots whispering against the wet boards, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the rail. The sound of oars came again, steady, deliberate, then faded into the hush of the bay, as if whoever rowed wished to be remembered only in fragments. The skiff was gone. The rope that had tethered it still hung over the side, cut clean near the knot. No fray, no hesitation. One stroke of a sharp blade, and the boat had slipped into the dark. Inga joined you, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Jorund," she said, naming the wiry man. There was no surprise in her voice, only the tightness of someone who had seen such vanishings before. Either he left on his own, or someone called him. Kettle scanned the water, but the stillness had already swallowed whatever trace the skiff might have left. "If he's gone to the ones who made that mark," he said, "we won't see him again unless they mean for us to." Eric's voice came low from the other ship, carrying across the water. "Report." "Man missing," Kettle called back. "Rope cut clean, no sign of struggle." A pause, then Eirik, "Finish your sweep and return. The tide's turning." Inga's jaw worked, but she nodded. "We checked the stern, then we're done." You moved together, keeping to the starboard side where the planks felt less treacherous. The wreck's stern rose slightly above the rest of the deck, its timbers groaning softly as the tide shifted beneath. A small companionway there led into what might have been the captain's quarters. The door hung crooked on one hinge, the wood around the latch splintered. Inside, the air was heavier still, tinged with the sourness of things that had begun to spoil. Charts lay scattered across a narrow table, their ink blurred where water had crept in. A sea chest sat open against the far wall, its contents, a few garments, a pair of boots and a small wooden idol, half floating in the shallow water that had pooled inside. The idol drew your attention. It was no taller than your hand, carved from driftwood, polished smooth by years in the sea. The shape was abstract, twisting lines that suggested both wave and serpent, with a single drilled hole where an eye might have been. Around its base, faint etchings marked the wood, the same spiral you had seen carved near the hatch below. Kettle lifted it carefully, the wet wood dark against his palm. "It's theirs," he said simply. Before you could answer, a sound drifted through the open doorway, low, resonant, and far too familiar. The horn. It came from beyond the bay, muted by distance, but still deep enough to curl in your gut. Once, twice, then silence. Inga's face hardened. "They're closer than I thought." She turned to you and Kettle. "Take the idol. Eirik needs to see it. I'll check the aft hold for anything else and meet you at the rail." You tucked the carving into a leather pouch at your belt, wrapping it in a scrap of sailcloth to keep it from knocking against your gear. Kettle led the way back across the deck, every step quick but measured. The water between the wreck and your ship lay black and unbroken, yet you could not shake the sense that something moved just below the surface, keeping pace with you. Eirik was waiting at the longship's rail, eyes sharp in the half-light. You held out the pouch. "We found this in the captain's quarters, same spiral as the mark below." He opened it, glanced inside, and closed it again without touching the wood. "Good. That's enough for tonight." Behind you, Inga emerged from the wreck's stern, a coil of rope over one shoulder. Her axe hung at her side, but her other hand was empty. "Nothing else worth taking," she called. The crews worked quickly, hauling you and Kettle back aboard. Inga followed, her boots dripping onto the deck. The longship's sail was already half raised, the other crew's oars in the water. The tide had begun to pull outward, a long, steady breath drawing both ships toward the bay's mouth. The wind followed, cool and insistent, brushing the mist into low, shifting veils. Somewhere far off, the horn sounded again, just once this time, longer and deeper than before. No one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of timbers, the soft slap of oars, and the quiet rush of the tide, carrying you out into the open sea. The bay fell away behind you, the wreck's dark silhouette shrinking until it was no more than another shadow among many along the jagged coast. The wind freshened, tugging at the sail until the canvas strained with a low, steady hum. The two ships ran close, their hulls slicing parallel wakes through the black water. Eric stood at the steerboard, the pouch with the idol hanging from a thong around his neck, hidden beneath his cloak. His face was turned toward the open sea, but you saw the way his eyes cut now and then toward the mist gathering astern. It did not billow like natural fog. It crept, curling low along the surface, following rather than drifting. No one spoke of it, though you could feel its presence tightening the air. Kettle rowed without looking back, his shoulders shifting with the rhythm, every stroke placed as if the strength behind it mattered more than usual. Hrani's lyre lay untouched at his feet, his fingers flexing idly as though they might find a song later when the night felt less watchful. The woman's ship kept slightly ahead, her crew working in silence. Lantern light glowed faintly near her stern, shielded so it could not be seen from farther off. Once you caught the woman's silhouette at her helm, cloak pressed flat by the wind, head turning as if she too listened for a sound that might rise out of the dark. An hour passed this way. The mist held its distance, neither closing nor fading, as though it was content simply to remind you that it had chosen a direction. The sea beneath it was unnervingly calm, no chop to break the surface, no whitecaps to scatter the moonlight. When the coastline curved away to starboard, Eric gave a low command. "We break west. Keep the wind on your left cheek. Let the tide pull you off their line." The turn was made without fuss. Your longship angled into the open water, the other vessel shadowing the maneuver. The change in heading made the mist slide across the edge of your sight like a slow beast adjusting its course. You watched it until the wind shifted again, bringing the tang of open sea and the first hint of swell beneath the keel. It was near midnight when Eirik finally gave the order to lash the oars and lower the sail. The sky had cleared, and a scatter of stars wheeled high above. The ships drifted together in a slow convergence until their rails nearly touched. The woman stepped to the side of her deck, her voice low enough to force the men nearest her to lean in to hear. "You kept your pace," she said, "and you've brought something worth more than whatever's in that wreck. That carving," she gestured toward the pouch hidden under Eirik's cloak. "I've seen it twice before. Once on a ship we found gutted in the northern straits, once on a man washed ashore without his tongue. Both times the horn followed." Eric's expression did not change. "And you think it means what?" "That whoever carries it belongs to something that moves between shore and sea without caring which it claims." Her eyes flicked toward you. "You went below, didn't you? Did you feel it?" You remembered the closeness of the air in the wreck, the faint disturbance in the water, the way the spiral mark seemed to watch you without eyes. You nodded once. It was like the tide waiting to turn. The woman's mouth tightened. "A good way to put it." Eric's tone was even. "We'll study it when we have shore under us. For now, we keep ahead of whatever claims that mark." Her ship pulled away then, angling southward, her oars dipping quietly into the black water. Eric let her go without question, though his gaze followed until she was no more than a pale sail against the starlit swell. The rest of the night passed in silence, the crew sleeping in turns on the benches, cloaks drawn tight against the cold. You stayed awake longer than your watch required, listening for any sound that might rise from the horizon behind. Only the slow pulse of the sea and the occasional creak of the timbers answered. When dawn finally came, it was a pale and watery light, spilling over a sea that seemed emptier than it had the day before. The mist was gone, burned away or simply withdrawn, but the air still carried a trace of it, as though the sea had not entirely let you out of its hand. Eric called for the sail to be set again, his voice steady but quieter than usual. The pouch with the idol still hung beneath his cloak. No one asked to see it. No one had to. Its presence was a weight every man aboard could feel, even if they did not speak of it. The wind carried you westward, away from Stormhand's Bay and whatever watched from its fog. But the thought came to you more than once before the sun was high. Distance was not the same as escape. The morning wore on under a thin, colourless sky, the kind that gives no promise of what the weather will decide. The sea rolled in long, low swells, steady enough that the men could loosen their shoulders at the oars. Still, no one laughed. Even the smallest talk was pared down to what was necessary. Adjust this line, trim that sail, pass the water skin forward. The idol hung unseen beneath Eric's cloak, but its presence sat in the ship like a weight that shifted whenever the hull leaned. Rani finally took up his lyre again, though he played nothing bright. The notes came slow, almost searching, each one drifting out over the water, as if testing how far sound could travel before it was swallowed. The rhythm matched the seethed and fall, a tide of its own, and for a little while it seemed to give the crew something to breathe by. By mid-morning, the coastline reappeared to starboard, low cliffs with gulls wheeling above, their cries sharp in the cold air. The land looked empty, no smoke, no sign of huts, only the rough shapes of stone and the darker smudge of pine beyond. Eric steered nearer, not to land, but to keep the shore in sight, using it as a guide while the wind stayed uncertain. Kettle sat beside you, his oar resting in the thole pins as the sail took the work. He spoke without looking at you. That woman knew more than she said. The way she looked when you told her about the hold, like she'd already guessed what you'd find there. She's seen it before, you said. Twice, she said. Aye, and twice the horn after. That's not something you hear and forget. Ahead, Eric's voice cut through the wind. Point there, see it? He lifted his chin toward a dark jut of rock pushing into the sea like a crooked finger. We'll take shelter on the far side. The wind will swing there, and I want to see if the tide carries anything to us. The change in heading brought the ship into a fresher breeze. The sail pulled full, and the deck leaned, sending the smell of tar and salt deeper into your lungs. As you rounded the headland, the sea smoothed, sheltered by the cliff's bulk. A narrow cove opened before you, its mouth guarded by two tall pillars of stone, worn thin in their middles by years of tide and storm. Inside, the water lay calmer still, rippling gently against a strip of shingle at the base of the cliffs. Eric ordered the sail down, and the ship rode in under light strokes. The sound of the oars echoed strangely here, bouncing off the stone as if the cove itself were listening. Once the keel touched, the crew hauled her up enough to settle. The shingle crunched under boots as men stepped ashore, stretching legs and shoulders. The air smelled faintly of kelp drying on the rocks, and somewhere above, unseen birds called in harsh, abrupt notes. You climbed partway up the slope to where the cliff met a tumble of boulders. From here, the view opened to the wider sea beyond the stone pillars. You saw nothing moving, no sails, no hint of mist, but the horizon seemed to carry an extra weight, as though it was keeping something just behind its line. Eric joined you, his boots silent on the loose rock. He didn't look at you when he spoke. We won't outrun it forever. You mean the horn. And whatever it calls, ships perhaps, or something that uses ships like hands. His fingers brushed the pouch beneath his cloak, not drawing it out. This mark, it's not for the eyes of the dead. It's meant to be seen by the living. You thought of the spiral carved below decks, the lines of it catching the dim light like the curl of a wave about to break. Then whoever made it wanted us to know. Eric's gaze stayed on the horizon. Aye, which means we'll see it again. Not in some far place either. Down on the shingle, Rani's music started again, a soft thread winding up toward you. The tune was older than the ship, older than your village, one your mother had hummed while mending nets, the kind that carried more memory than words. It wrapped around the cove like a slow tide, and for a moment the air felt lighter. Then Kettle's voice came from below, sharp enough to cut the tune. Captain! Something in the water. You and Eric scrambled down the rocks. Near the base of the nearer stone pillar, a shape bobbed in the rippling tide. A bundle, dark and sodden, half caught on the kelp. Two men waded out, the cold biting at their legs, and hauled it in. It was a body. A man, broad of chest, dressed in a salt-stiff tunic. His skin was pale and bloated, but the wound at his temple was clear, clean-edged, the same as the others. In his hand, locked tight even in death, was a strip of wet leather. Eric pried it free. Stamped into it, faint but unmistakable, was the same spiral. No one spoke for a long moment. The gulls above called once, twice, then fell silent. The tide lapped at the shingle with small, deliberate sounds, as though it had delivered something it had been holding for you. The body was laid on the shingle above the tide line, where the stones held the day's fading warmth. The crew gathered in a loose half-circle, their boots crunching in the quiet. No one asked who the man was. Death had already taken away the part that could answer. The spiral stamped into the strip of leather lay on a flat rock beside him, darkened by salt and age. Eric crouched, turning the strip over in his hands. "It's not a badge," he said, almost to himself. "Too plain for that, and it's not from a belt or harness, cut too clean on both ends." He tapped it against his palm, then glanced toward you. "It's a token. Given or taken, it means something." Rani leaned on his knees, peering at the mark. If it's a token, it might be a promise or a warning. His voice was low, but the words carried in the cove's close air. In the pause that followed, the gulls cried again, restless now, as if something in the cliffs had stirred. Kettle broke the silence. "If the tide brought him here, it means he went into the water not far from this place. The current would have dragged him west otherwise." "Aye," Eric said. "Which means the ones with this mark have been closer than we thought." He straightened, slipping the strip into the pouch with the idol. "We bury him here. The sea has taken enough." The crew set to work without complaint. A hollow was dug in the loose shingle, lined with flat stones to keep the tide from pulling it apart too quickly. You found yourself standing beside Inga, who had joined from the other ship. She watched the digging with the stillness of someone measuring the weight of the moment before deciding where to put it down. "You've seen this mark before," you said quietly. Her jaw flexed, but she nodded. "On a ship near the mouth of the Ormel Fjord. 3 dead aboard. All marked, some with leather like this, some with carvings on bits of driftwood. No cargo left worth taking, but the ropes were new and the sail whole. The hull was set adrift, like they wanted someone to find it." "And did someone?" She glanced at you sidelong. "We did, and 3 days later we heard the horn in the fog." The burial was simple. Stones over the shrouded body, a few words from Rani in the old tongue, and the tide's voice filling the spaces between. When it was done, Eirik signalled the crew back to the ship. The air had shifted, lighter in some way but also thinner, as if the cove had given you what it meant to and now wanted you gone. You pushed off under oar, the longship gliding between the stone pillars into the open swell. The other vessel followed, her sail already catching the evening breeze. The horizon ahead was a deepening blue, the first stars pricking through where the sky was clearest. The wind held steady, and for a while there was only the hiss of the bow cutting water and the creak of the oarlocks. But as the headland fell behind, you felt it, a faint change in the air, as if the world had taken a breath and not yet let it go. Kettle noticed too. His grip tightened on the oar, though his stroke never faltered. Then the horn sounded. It was farther than before, the tone softened by distance, but still heavy enough to find its way into the bones. One long note, then a pause that felt deliberate, followed by a shorter call that seemed to answer itself. No one looked back. Eric's voice carried without strain. "Keep the pace. Don't break the wind." You did as told, but the sound lingered in your chest, a weight that kept time with your heartbeat. The mist did not appear, not yet, but you could sense it gathering somewhere beyond sight, waiting for the right wind to bring it in. Hours passed. The other ship held close, the faint glow of her lantern a small moving star on the water. The horn did not sound again, but the sea had taken on a stillness that was not natural for this stretch of coast. Even the gulls had gone quiet. When your watch ended, you lay on the bench with your cloak over you, staring at the slice of night sky above the mast. The stars wheeled slowly, their patterns steady, but you found yourself thinking of the spiral on the leather and the one carved into the wreck's hull. Shapes without beginning or end, meant to draw the eye inward until you forgot to look away. And somewhere out in the dark, past the reach of your sight, you imagined the horn-bearer standing in his place, patient as the tide, knowing that the sea gives second chances to those who wait. Dawn came slow and colourless, a thin wash of light that seemed to drain the world rather than fill it. The sea lay in long, glassy folds, the swell gentle but steady, carrying the ship as if in the palm of a giant's hand. The wind had eased in the night, enough that the oars were out again, dipping and rising in a rhythm that matched the crew's muted mood. The other ship kept to your port side, close enough that you could see faces when they looked your way, though few did. Inga stood at her bow, her cloak pulled tight, eyes scanning the horizon ahead. Every so often she would glance back toward the stern of her vessel, as if counting her crew to be certain no one had slipped away in the night. Eric steered without speaking, the pouch containing the idol and the strip of leather still hidden beneath his cloak. You had seen him touch it once during your watch, not pulling it out, just pressing his fingers against the weight of it as if to confirm it was still there. Around mid-morning, the coastline shifted again, a jagged line of cliffs breaking into smaller, weathered stacks scattered into the shallows. The sea here changed its voice, the deep rush of swell broken by the hiss and boom of waves meeting stone. The smell of kelp thickened in the air, mingled with the faint scent of wood smoke carried from somewhere inland. Eirik called for the sail to be raised, letting the wind take more of the work. "We'll pass through the stacks before midday," he said. "There's a channel deep enough if you keep to the markers. Once clear, we'll look for a cove to rest the ships." Ketil leaned toward you as he set his oar in its loop. "These stacks are good hiding ground," he murmured, "for gulls, seals, or men who don't want to be seen until it's too late." You nodded, your eyes already tracing the dark gaps between the rocks. The water boiled white where the swell struck hidden ledges, and the channel Eirik meant was just visible. A long, twisting ribbon of calmer water, marked by a single upright spar driven into the rock. The wind freshened as you entered, funneled by the cliffs into sharp, irregular gusts. The sail bellied and shifted, the tiller creaking under Eirik's hand. You kept your eyes moving, watching the shadowed inlets where the rock face met the water. Once you caught the flash of movement high on a ledge, just a gull lifting off, but it left your pulse quicker for a moment. Halfway through, Rani, standing near the mast, lifted a hand. "There," he said quietly. On the far side of a narrow cut between two stacks, a shape rode low in the water. At first it seemed no more than driftwood, dark and worn, but as the ship angled closer, you saw the straight lines of a hull, small but built for sea. The sail was furled, the mast bare, and the bow was beached lightly on a tongue of flat rock. No crew stood aboard. Eric's gaze sharpened. "Hold to the channel," he said. "Don't drift to her." As you passed, you caught more detail. A thin line of seaweed trailing from the stern, a broken oar floating nearby, the hull's timbers pale where the pitch had worn away. And there, carved into the prow, was the spiral, weathered but clear. Inga's ship slowed as it came alongside yours, her voice carrying across the water. "It's empty." "Looks it," Eirik replied. "Or meant to look it." "Then it's meant for us," she said, her tone flat. The channel widened ahead, the swell smoothing out as you left the stacks behind. Eirik kept the ship on course until the cliffs began to soften into lower ground, then turned toward a narrow inlet sheltered by a shoulder of land. The water here was calm, green with the reflection of the pines that crowded the shore. The crews brought both ships in, grounding them gently on the sandy shallows. Men stepped ashore to gather driftwood and check the tide line. You followed Eirik as he climbed a low rise above the cove, from which you could see back toward the stacks. The small, abandoned boat was still there, its pale bow just visible between two rocks. The spiral caught the sun in a way that seemed deliberate. "They're leaving signs now," you said. "Aye," Eirik replied. "The wreck at Stormhand was bait for those who seek gain. This is bait for those who seek answers." His eyes stayed fixed on the boat. "The difference is, bait for gain might let you go if you've nothing worth taking. Bait for answers doesn't let go until it has them." A gust of wind shifted through the pines, carrying the sound of the sea's endless breathing. Far off, faint enough that you almost doubted it, came a single low note of the horn. Not near, not urgent, just present. Enough to say, it knows where you are. The horn's note faded into the wind, leaving behind a silence that felt almost shaped, hollowed out to fit it. Eirik did not move for a time, his eyes still fixed on the pale bow of the abandoned boat. Below, the crews went about their work with a care that was quieter than usual, their voices kept low as if the sound might carry farther than they wished. Inga came up the slope to stand beside you, her boots pressing soft prints into the pine needles. "It's not chance," she said, her gaze following Eirik's. "They knew we'd pass here, knew the channel would force us close enough to see it." Eirik answered without looking away. "Then the only question is whether they meant us to follow or to stay away." She folded her arms. Either way, they're telling us we're already in their water. You remembered the first time you'd heard the horn, thick in the fog, and the sense that the sound had been aimed. Not simply made, but placed, set loose like a net into which the ship might drift without ever seeing the mesh. The feeling was here again, stronger now that the sea was calm and the horizon so clear. Kettle appeared with 2 other men, carrying armfuls of driftwood. "Fire on the beach?" he asked. Eirik shook his head. "No smoke. We'll keep cold tonight. Eat what we have dry." It was the right choice, though it meant the air grew colder as the shadows lengthened. You sat near the waterline, chewing hard bread and dried fish, while the tide whispered against the sand. The 2 ships lay in the shallows like sleeping animals, their hulls rocking gently with the movement of the water. The pines behind gave shelter from the wind, but also hemmed the cove in, making the sky feel smaller. Rani sat cross-legged a little way off, his lyre across his knees. He plucked no tune, only touched the strings lightly now and then, the faint sounds half swallowed by the sea. "The mark," he said at last, his voice carrying just enough to reach those closest, "is not just for fear. It's for memory. You see it once, you can't forget it. That way, when the horn sounds again, you know it's meant for you." No one replied. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Night came without ceremony. The stars were clear overhead, but a haze lay low over the horizon, blurring the meeting of sea and sky. You took the second watch, pacing the edge of the tide where wet sand shone faintly in the starlight. The sound of the water was steady, unbroken, until it wasn't. It began as a change in the rhythm, a slower pull between waves, as though the tide had paused mid-breath. Then, faintly, a new sound threaded through it, the soft dip and lift of oars. Not many, 4, perhaps 6, but moving with the same unhurried precision you'd heard before. You turned toward the mouth of the cove. Out beyond the dark line of the headland, something shifted, a shadow on the water where the starlight should have been. It lingered there, just outside the cove's reach, not advancing, not retreating. Eirik came up beside you, his boots silent on the sand. "How long?" "Moments only," you said. "It hasn't moved." He stared into the dark for a while, then said, "They're letting us see them. That means they'll be here still at dawn." He left you to your watch, but sleep came thin for the crew that night. Even those off duty kept their cloaks on, lying with weapons close, their eyes opening at the smallest change in the water's tone. Once, near the turn of the tide, the horn sounded again, only a fragment of a note, as if whoever held it had half a mind to call, and then thought better of it. When the first pale light of morning touched the cove, the shadow was gone. The sea lay empty beyond the headland, the horizon clean, but you knew they had not gone far. The feeling was still there, in the weight of the air, and in the way the gulls circled wide of the channel. By the time the ships were pushed off the sand, the sky was clear, and the wind light from the east. Eirik took the steerboard and set a course that would carry you along the coast, but keep the stacks well behind. Even so, you found your gaze turning often toward the open sea, searching for that shadow to return, and half hoping it wouldn't. The morning wind was gentle, enough to draw the sail, but not so strong as to demand all hands at the ropes. The sea rolled in a low, steady swell, the kind that lulled a ship into thinking the day might pass without incident. Yet no one aboard carried that ease in their shoulders. The memory of the shadow at the cove's mouth lingered, and more than one pair of eyes turned backward toward the horizon, checking the water behind as much as the way ahead. The coastline kept its distance to starboard, a dark ribbon of cliffs and pine-topped ridges, their shapes softened by the morning haze. Occasionally a rocky outcrop jutted into the sea, forcing the ships to angle farther out before coming in again. Eirik kept a careful hand on the tiller, his gaze moving between shore and open water in slow sweeps. Kettle rowed beside you, his strokes easy but deliberate. "They could be out there still," he said without looking up, "just far enough to keep out of sight until the fog finds us again." "They'll follow?" you asked. He gave a short nod. "A hunt is no hunt if you lose sight of the trail, but I think they're not chasing, just waiting for the right ground." Ahead, Inga's ship held the lead, her sail catching more of the wind as she angled slightly inland. The morning light caught the pale streaks in her hair and the bright rim of her shield where it hung by the gunwale. She stood near her mast, speaking briefly to a man at her side before turning her gaze back to the horizon. By midday, the wind had freshened, filling the sail and sending spray over the bow. The rhythm of the ship changed, sharper now, each wave met with a solid lift that sent the oarlocks creaking. The crew worked in silence, each man settling into the long hours of motion. It was Hrani who noticed it first. He had been sitting with his lyre, playing no tune, only plucking at strings as if to feel their readiness. His head lifted suddenly, eyes narrowing toward the open sea. "There," he said, something low in the water. You followed his gaze, and at first you saw nothing but the shimmer of sunlight on the swell. Then, between the rise and fall of two waves, a shape broke the surface. Long, narrow, dark. It vanished almost at once, but not before you caught the glint of wet wood. Arik turned the tiller a fraction. "Not driftwood," he said. "They're keeping parallel to us." The shape appeared again, closer this time, before slipping away beneath the swell. No sail, no oars, just the brief, deliberate showing of a hull. Kettle's grip tightened on his oar. "That's no fishing boat." The other ship saw it too. Inga's voice carried over the water. "They're marking us." Eric's reply was calm. "Then we keep them on the side we can see." The hours stretched. The dark shape surfaced now and then, always in the same quarter, never closing, never falling away. It moved like a wolf pacing a herd, close enough to remind you it was there, far enough to keep you from knowing when it might leap. Toward late afternoon, the coastline changed. The cliffs broke into low, rolling headlands, the sea between them deep and green. Here and there, narrow inlets cut into the land, their mouths half hidden by rock and shadow. Eric steered for one of these, a cleft between two sheer faces that leaned together overhead like the jaws of a trap. The wind eased as you entered, the water smoothing into a glassy calm. The walls of the inlet rose steep, streaked with lichen and bird droppings, the air cooler in their shadow. Somewhere high above, you heard the cry of a raven. The inlet curved inward, and soon the mouth was lost to sight. You felt the ship slow, the oars dipping with quiet strokes. Then you saw it, anchored in the still water ahead, a small boat. Empty. The spiral was carved into its thwart, fresh and deep. No one spoke. The inlet seemed to hold the silence close, pressing it into your ears. You could hear your own heartbeat, the faint lap of water against the hull, the slow creak of wood. Arik's hand stayed steady on the tiller, but his voice was low when he said, "We turn here, no further in." As the ship began to swing, the faint sound of oars reached you, not from ahead but from behind, near the hidden mouth of the inlet. Slow, even, coming closer. The sound of the oars grew clearer, a measured dipping that echoed off the stone walls until it was impossible to tell exactly how far away the rowers were. Every man aboard had turned toward the mouth of the inlet, though no one shifted their feet or reached for steel. Movement was kept quiet, deliberate, shields angled within arm's reach, oars lifted out of the water to keep the hull still. Eric's voice was barely above the lapping of the tide. "Let them come into the light. We'll see who it is before we decide." The inlet's bend made the wait feel longer than it was. Then, in the shadow where the two walls leaned together, a bow slipped into view. It was long and narrow, the prow carved with the same spiral you'd seen before. Only this time, the mark had been painted in a dark, tarred red that caught the glint of water as it moved. The ship behind it emerged slowly, like something deciding whether to reveal itself. 10 oars to a side, their rhythm unbroken. No sail, no voices. The rowers were hooded, their faces in shadow beneath the brims, but their movements were as uniform as the strokes of a single hand. At the stern stood a man wrapped in a dark cloak, the horn cradled in the crook of his arm. The horn was larger than you had imagined, the curve of it smooth and pale, polished by years of handling. Its mouth was bound in metal, and faint etchings ran along its length, lines that curled and twisted in the same spiral pattern, repeating and folding back on themselves like a tide, pulling and returning. He didn't raise it to his lips. He didn't need to. The sight of it was enough to knot the air between the two ships. Eric stood unmoving at the steerboard, his face unreadable. You could feel the crew around you holding themselves still, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that sudden movement might be taken as an answer to a question not yet asked. The stranger's ship closed the distance until you could see the wet sheen on the planks, the faint drift of smoke from a small brazier near the bow. The smell reached you, a mix of pitch, salt, and something faintly metallic, like cold iron drawn from deep water. When the two hulls were no more than 10 strides apart, the man with the horn raised his free hand. His voice carried easily, low but shaped so every word found its way across the water. "You've taken something that bears the mark." Eric didn't deny it. "We found it in a wreck." The man's head tilted slightly. "Then it was given to you, and what is given is not taken back, unless the giver wishes it." No one moved. The inlet's walls made every sound intimate, the faint creak of a rope, the soft breath of the crew beside you. "What does the mark mean?" Eric asked. A pause, as if the man were considering whether the question was worth the air it took. "It means the sea has spoken for you. Whether you choose to answer is yours to decide." His gaze shifted to you then, holding just long enough to make the water feel colder. Some answer willingly. Some must be taught how. The oars dipped again, not in retreat, but to keep his vessel steady against the tide's small pull. You could see now that the rowers' hoods were drawn tight, shadows hiding more than faces. None looked at you. Eric's hand rested on the tiller, the motion of his knuckles betraying a thought he didn't voice. "If the sea has spoken for us," he said evenly, "it can speak again. Until then, we keep what we've found." The man with the horn didn't frown, didn't smile. "Then you will hear it again." The oars began to move in earnest now, the ship sliding backward with a smoothness that spoke of long practice. The horn-bearer never turned his head as the distance widened, his gaze fixed until the bend of the inlet swallowed them whole. Only when the last echo of the oar strokes faded did anyone breathe deeply again. Kettle muttered something under his breath, half prayer, half curse. Eric turned the ship fully then, the prow pointing toward open water. "We're done here," he said. "They've had their look. Now we'll choose where the next one happens." The oars bit into the water, the inlet's shadows falling away as you pulled for the mouth. The sea outside seemed almost bright after the stone walls, but you knew the open horizon didn't mean you'd left them behind. Somewhere out there, the horn-bearer was rowing to his own chosen ground, waiting for the moment when he'd raise that pale curve to his lips and let the sound carry again. The open sea took you back into its long, rolling rhythm, the inlet's narrow walls shrinking behind until they were only a pair of dark lines on the coast. The wind was fresher out here, moving across the deck and carrying away some of the heaviness left by the horn-bearer's gaze, but not all. It lingered like the taste of brine at the back of your throat. The other ship drew alongside, Inga at her helm. She studied Eric for a long moment before speaking. "You met him before?" Eric shook his head once. "Not in flesh, only in stories." "What kind of stories?" "The kind told when the fire burns low and the wind sounds too much like a voice," he said. "The kind where you don't ask whether they're true until you've no choice but to find out." Inga's expression didn't change, but she nodded slowly. "Then I think you've found out." She let her ship fall back, and the two hulls kept pace without another word exchanged. The crew settled into the work, oars and sail together, each man turning his eyes outward, searching the horizon for any sign of the long, low hull that had slid back into the shadows. By late afternoon, the coast to starboard opened into a broad sweep of headland, its back covered in pine and its feet in long, pale beaches. Eric guided the ship toward one of these, where the tide pulled gently at the sand and the dunes hid what lay beyond. You grounded the ship on the firm, wet line where the waves just broke and climbed ashore. The sand was cool under your boots, the air still carrying the scent of salt, but tinged now with the resin of nearby trees. A few gulls lifted off from the dunes, their wings bright in the sinking light. Eric came up beside you. "We'll rest here. No fires, not yet. I want the hull patched where she took spray yesterday, and I want eyes on the water until the moon is high." The work was quiet and steady. Some gathered driftwood for later, stacking it above the tide line. Others walked the length of the ship, checking the seams and the rigging. You joined Kettle on the rise of the nearest dune, from where you could see the curve of the beach in both directions. The sea was calm, its surface silvering as the sun slid lower, but every so often you thought you saw a darker line far out, there and gone before you could fix your gaze on it. You think they'll follow in tonight? Kettle asked. They've followed this far, you said. I think they're waiting for the right tide. He grunted, not in disagreement, and adjusted the strap of his shield. When the moon rose, pale and thin, the ships lay drawn up together on the sand, their shadows stretching toward the water. The crew slept in turns, cloaks pulled tight, weapons close. The only sounds were the soft rush of the tide and the occasional rustle from the dunes where some small night creature moved unseen. It was near midnight when the horn came. Not loud this time, not the full, rolling call you'd heard before. It was a single note, drawn out but muted, as if it had been sounded from far beneath the surface of the water. The sound seemed to rise up through the sand under your feet, to fill the air without touching your ears. Every man woke at once, sitting up in the moonlight, eyes turned toward the sea. Out beyond the line where the moonlight ended, a shape moved, low and long, the water breaking differently around it than around the swell. Then another, farther off, and another. No sails, no oars visible, just the slow, sure glide of hulls moving where the current wished them to. They did not close in. They did not vanish. They kept their place on the edge of sight, like a ring drawn loosely around the shore. The horn did not sound again. Eric stood at the water's edge, the pouch with the idol at his chest. He did not call to them, did not signal. He only watched. After a time, he turned back toward the ships, his voice low. They'll wait, and so will we. You lay down again before dawn, but sleep was thin, the images of those dark shapes drifting in the edges of your thoughts. When the sun rose, the horizon was empty, but you knew they had not gone far. The sea had spoken for you, the horn-bearer had said, and whatever answer it expected, it was content to wait until you gave it.